Hello and welcome everyone to the May 2021 Integration Downunder. Let's just go quickly through some slides and then we'll get started. We've got our organizers for Integration Downunder, which is Martin, Dan, Renee, Wagner, and myself. And tonight's talk is Wagner talking on the integration. If you're familiar at all with the LogicApps and things, you know there's some big announcements happening at the Build conference in a week. Next week, I guess, is when it's happening. So that'll be some good information on that. And part of the stuff that Wagner's going to talk about is some of the stuff that integrates well with the new version of the LogicApps, the isolated version. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Wagner. Let me just take my screen off and let me add Wagner to the stream. And welcome, Wagner.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Bill. It's good to be here again as presented because most of the time I'm here as one of the organizers. So as Bill was talking about, we're going to have a quick chat of what's new on AIS. So before that, most of you already know me. So I'm Wagner Silveira. I'm the integration practice lead for Theta and also one of the Azure MVPs here on New Zealand. If you wanted to talk to me, you can find me on WSilveiranZ on Twitter. You can go to wagner.silveira@note2self.tech and send me an email, or you can just look at my blog, https note2self.tech, and in there you can leave a comment or get in touch with me. So let's take a quick look at the agenda. What we have on the agenda today is look a little bit about the LogicApps news, right? We're going to be talking about the updates on developer tools, and in this case specifically about the introduction of Azurite, and talk a bit about the new Azure storage options, Azurite and some others. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at API management news with the new validation policies that might make your life much easier if you needed to do some validation on inbound or outbound requests or responses. And after that, I'm going to show you some of the resources that we have available. Just let me give 1 second. I'll change one thing here. There we go. Okay, so first let's talk about the LogicApps developer tools improvements. The main improvement that we have in here is a new local storage called Azurite. People that works with the storage emulators probably already know about Azurite and has been using that before. As I said, it's basically a storage emulator similar to the Azure storage emulator that we had before. If you needed, that was one of the prerequisites to run LogicApps. So why is that important? Why Azurite instead of just keeping using the Azure storage emulator? Or why Microsoft is putting a lot more emphasis on that? The first thing is that is really multi-platform. So if you're using Mac or if you're using Linux, there is a chance that you would not be able to use the Azure storage emulator before, but you're going to be able to take advantage of Azurite. Also, it gives your choice of setup, right? Before, you always had to run the Azure storage that was an exe file on your Azure SDK, and you have to run that to have this available. With the Azurite, you have the ability to run that as a command line, as a Docker image, or as a VS Code extension. And you're able to set up with any one of those ways, right? Specifically for LogicApps, there is a little gotcha, because as soon as I saw VS Code extension, I said, yes, I'm just going to install the VS Code extension, and that's what I'm going to be using. and that is going to be like the easy peasy. But the version of the VS Code extension that is available right now doesn't support table storage. And for LogicApps, it requires not just the blob storage, but also the table storage for it to run properly. Based on, from what I see, seems like it makes use to both blob, queues, and table. So without any further ado, let's take a quick look at the how is that working, what you needed to do to install, and how you can turn it on the Azurite, plus a little bit of tips on how to use that for development. Let me find my VS Code. I'll just make it a little bit bigger, make it easy for you guys to look at. So, and before that, if you wanted to install Azurite as
we're not seeing your VS Code. We're seeing the Azurite demo.
Okay, so I'll have to take a look at the other side. Thanks for that, Bill. So I'm going to be looking there. So can see everything now, right? Bill?
Yes, everything's good.
Okay, so if you wanted to install Azurite as if you wanted to install Azurite using npm, you just needed to run the npm install -g Azurite, and that's going to be the command that you needed to install. It's going to be installed on your global package, and with that, everything is going to be fine. I already have that installed, so I'm not trying to install it again. Okay. But the other way that you can access Azurite is getting the following image. So mcr.microsoft.com/Azure storage/Azurite. So you can pull that image into your local repository, and you're going to be able to run that. Okay. And in order to get Azurite to run, you can do things as simple as just run the Azurite command, and then now I say that it's going to be listening on all those ports. There is and stop that. And there is also that. It's this. So in all the commands, you can say where is going to be the location for your work folder. And that would be quite useful in this case, because you might have wanted to keep your tables always in the same place, especially when you're working with LogicApps or Azure Functions, because you don't want to have to recreate your keys every time that you run a debug or every time that you run the command, right? So in this case, my command maybe would look at something like this. If I go to my structure here, I have a place called so I have on my C tools Azurite is where I usually put in my information, and it's going to be creating a structure like that for you. Okay, so I could do Azurite -L C tools Azurite. Now it's running, but it's looking at my local folder. That is going to be quite useful when you're running the LogicApps, because then you know where all the keys are going to be created and how to recover all of that. So same thing. Right now, I'm running that container here, right? And that container would be is running with the Azurite, but it's pointing to a specific to no location. So if I stop that and remove, if you wanted to do the same kind of thing, initiate your Azurite Docker container, but wanted it to point to a specific location so it can use all the time, you can do something similar. Just let me stop that one. And I'll do this now. So for that, you just needed to get, where is my, there we go, too many things. So I'm doing a Docker run for that image that we saw, and I'm exposing the 3 ports. The 10,000 is the blob storage port, the 10,001 is the queue port, and the 10,002 is the table port. But I set in a volume. My data folder is going to be pointing to C2's Azurite. That means that it's going to get that same data there, right? And just to show that that's correct, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a temp folder. You're going to see that it's actually going to be pointing to this folder here. So let's run this Docker container. Starting. It's running. Enable the things. And if I look at my files, and my data folder, you see that I have that temp there. Okay, so that means that now every time that the Azurite, if I run it with this command, every time that Azurite is running, it's going to be looking at the same location. And why is that important? Because when you're running the LogicApps, you needed to get the master keys or the keys for the LogicApp to run from the storage. And you don't want it to having to run everything again every time and having to replace your keys, especially if you're doing things like automating testing, or if you're creating something like this test count here. So just to prove that we need to use the Azurite or the some kind of emulator to get this, what I'm going to do now is first I'm going to stop that, so we don't have an instance of the Azurite or storage account running. And we can see that the LogicApps is looking at the use development storage equals true, right? So if I try to run, if I try to run this, it's probably going to crash. See, fail to verify Azure Web Job Storage Collection specified in location settings. Is the local emulator installed and running? So it gives you a warning that that is happening. Let's see what happens if I just start this. So now up and running. Let's try to do debug again. And every time for everyone to cross fingers. So it's building. Starting the host. So everything seems to be started. And it acquired a release of that instance ID here, A571F. So if you go back to this and you look at blob storage, we have two files, one that was created in 1405, one that was created now. Pretty much, let's see what we have on this. It's actually at 8:30. So let me open that with Notepad++. So see, that is the instance ID that he was talking about, A574871F. And so those are the keys that is going to be using. Okay. Now you should be able to look into the overview. Get that URL and run. And if I do the send request, just run and come back. Okay. So that means that everything is running locally using the Azurite storage account. Okay. So that is the first demo. Then following up of that, let's talk a little bit about LogicApps and the new storage, the new storage options. So it's really cool that we have that Azurite there. And now we have Azurite and we have the Azure storage on Azure, right? So a local emulator and the actual storage on Azure. What should I be using? And what should I do if I wanted to run that fully on-prem without using anything else outside of this? So we have more choice of storage. As I said, we have the storage account, right? And the storage account is which is what we have today already. It's really good for workloads that might scale to 0. And if you wanted to pay per usage. But what happens if, and basically, if you wanted to have a dependency on Azure, that's the other point here. The counterpart of that in on-prem at this stage is Azurite, but Microsoft is only recommending Azurite for multi-platform local development. So if you wanted to do local development, doesn't matter what platform you're using, you should be able to use that emulator and then streamline everything everywhere. The missing link in here is what I'll do if I wanted to run LogicApps off Azure, either in other clouds or if I wanted to run that on premises. This is where you should be using SQL Server Private Preview. So when you're using that, then you have much more fine control, right, on your cost and your choice of compute. Like you can scale it up for like really heavy workloads of Azure or somewhere else, and you have a much more predictable cost, especially on those cases where you're actually working with lots of executions where the cost of storage would ramp up, and you wouldn't have an idea of how much it would cost. With SQL, you know the throughput that you're going to take at a predictable cost. So how that works from the LogicApps point of view, I think a lot of us, or if you watch my two previous presentations, you probably remember that picture, right? So this is how LogicApps is sitting on top of the function runtime. So you have like your workflow runtime that is that manages your listeners, your interpreter, and the workflow actions, so the sequencer that put each one of the actions in sequence. Then you have the workflow orchestration engine that interacts with the Azure storage to like put information there, like a list of all the items or all the actions that needs to run in sequence, and then bringing each one of them to be executed through the function runtime. That little part here, assume that is some kind of interface and adapted to the Azure storage, right? So one of the things that they did with the Azurite was making sure that Azurite presents the same kind of interface for as the Azure storage, and because of that, they could just replace that. And the same thing happens here when you wanted to use the SQL storage. It's created a adapter layer that allow you to include the queues, the tables, and the blobs, but storing that in a SQL database that you have more control. Okay. So let's take a quick look at the demo. And full disclosure, my machine this afternoon was playing up a lot. I was able to connect with that and create the SQL database, but I was having some trouble with debugging. So if that happens, you know why. It's my machine, not necessarily the technology. So let's go back to this one. And what I'm going to do here now is I'll go and fully stop the browser. Oh, sorry, the Azurite. Okay, it stopped. So just to prove that it's stopped, if I stop that and I try to run it again, it's going to give you the same warning for me, right? What I need to do this time is I need to change my local settings to include now a set of new information here. And I'm going to pick that up from something that I had done previously and just explain what I understand from this, because that's brand new. I think is the private preview was enabled or open for people to start using yesterday. And if I go to my dev, so I just get in a different version of the local settings. And what it has here now is saying that the Azure Web Storage is empty, and the Azure Web Job Secret Storage is files. And this is the location where the database is going to be for the Azure SQL storage, right? Then you have like the other things that you had there before. The other change that I needed to do is I needed to get this to a very specific version of that extension bundle, and I think that's what broke some of my things. But anyway, what I'm gonna do on this one now is first I'm going to try to run that just as a designer, just to see if it opens the designer. So it's starting to set up that with the new things. And then after that, we're going to cross fingers and try to run debug on that. Did I forgot to change anything else? I think I did. The other place that I needed to do is here as well. And the reason for that is because we should be setting this up before you actually create any logic app. So all of this is set properly. And because I'm famous for that, I might forgot to save stuff. Let's see. If that doesn't work, then we create a brand new using the that set of information and see how it goes. There you go. So it connected, right, at the run the design time, and all of that is running using the all of that is running using the SQL Server. If I go and connect to my SQL, just wait a little bit. So if I connect to my SQL Express, that's what I'm using right now. You can see there is a database called Azure Storage Emulator DB 510. And in here on the tables, you have like similar set of things, including information about flows and subscriptions and things like that, right? So at this stage, this is kind of a black box for all of us. And now the moment of truth, like the fingers crossed, just to see if it's actually running. And there is 90% of chance that that doesn't work. Might be wrong. Okay, it's actually running. And it connected to this. So with some luck, you probably should be able to find inside the block container here or one of those blobs that, but I'm not even going to try to find that. It's just happy that it's actually running against that because I don't have the container running and I don't have any kind of other Azurite running. Also, I'm saying here in the local settings that are actually pointing to SQL. I'm not pointing to any Azure Web Job Storage. So just to prove, let's try to do the same thing. I'm going to be looking at the LogicApps demo, the same one. I'm going to get the overview because that signature should have changed since it's pointing to a different storage. and see if we can run that. All of this in the same place. It's running. You see there is a run even a bit faster this time, because that one is a stateful one. And instead of writing against the file systems, I was just doing writes against the database, right? You cannot feel that much, but it's already some gain there. So all of that is working as well. Really tempting the demo gods with that. So if you wanted to join the private preview, have access to that and start playing with some of this, you just needed to go to aka.ms, instead LogicApps SQL. And just to make sure that that is the correct one, let's try to open. Just a minute. There you go. It's correct, and you should be coming to something like this, right, where you can sign up for the private preview. Okay. So last one for tonight is the API management validation policy. So there's a lot of things that's coming from that, and I think that is going to be quite useful policy for us to use. So the validation policy is a way to actually use your API definition. So create your contract, and then use that contract to validate against the inbound your content if the information that you send is correct, your parameters, your headers, and on the way out, the status code. So with that, you can guarantee that the document that you create is people cannot send data that doesn't match that open API definition. But on the same time, for each one of the operations, you only returns the status codes that you said that was going to send, for example, right? And it is based on 3 types of action. You can create the validation and put just on detect mode. So I wanted to see what is coming that is not based on my API policy, but just log that somewhere. Or you can put that on ignore. So I create the policy, but I'm not ready to enable that. And I know there's a lot of people still don't comply. So I'm just getting ready for that. I can create the policy, but set to ignore when error happens. That's important. It's not that ignoring the rule. It still validates, but it ignores the errors. Or you can set to prevent. And if it's preventing, what happens is when you send in the things back, if you send a request that doesn't match the any one of your validation policies, it's going to stop at that point and return 400 bad request. There is a little gotcha on that one, that because it creates because you might have created APIs using different types of versions, right? Depending on when you create, there are a couple of validations. There is validate headers and validate parameters that might not work. And seems like the validate status codes might be on the same note, because I have one problem with this one. And if that happens, the only thing you needed to do is re-import the API, and then after that, reapply your policies, and it should be working fine. So let's take a look at what that actually means. First thing we're going to do is I'll go and pop up on the actual page. So consider be using that a little bit. So if you look at on the API management policies, what it has 4 new policies: validate content, validate parameters, headers, and status code, with 3 types of actions, as I said before. And you can see how those things work, right? So the validation content, you can validate the max size of a content in bytes, and you can validate any one of the content types that you created on your policy. Okay, and when you run that, you can say this one. You can say that if you're sending something that is bigger than 102,000 bytes, so 100 kilobytes probably. If the size is stacked, the action is prevent. But for my application JSON and how plus JSON, validate is just detecting. So it can do a combination of the things. Same thing is going to happen with parameters. You can specify saying if you're sending unspecified parameters, then you can ignore, and you can specify specific types of parameters, right? So you can specify headers, you can specify query, and you can specify path. So you can put everything together. Can validate the headers specifically. Same thing. And that one that I found really interesting is you can validate status code, especially if this example that I'm going to give you. If you're pushing things to the backend services, and the backend services is not conforming with the things you're doing, you can detect or you can prevent, and then at least you don't give the wrong type of status code back. But let's take a look at that in action. So I'll go to my API management developer in this case, and I'm going to look at one thing. I'm going to look at my API, and I have an API called validate Integration Downunder, right? And in here, I have my operations and I have my definitions. So this is something that it's a bit of the hidden gem from LogicApps. Sorry, from API management. You actually have the way to create all those different definitions, right, and actually create the proper schema for that. Like in this case, you're going to take a look at the thing I have: order ID, client email, order date, and items as required items or objects, right? And on my for my order object, I have all those elements that are required. And I say that my order ID can be between 0 and 1000. My client email is just a string. My order is a string, but of the type date. And then I have an array with items, which require item and quantity. So, and a comment. So I set up like a whole lot of things here. It's quite well-defined what I wanted with this thing. right? So for my operation, if I go and look at how I define that, I'm saying that my request should be of type order that we created. And I have a sample here. I'm so lazy as a developer that you're going to see that my sample doesn't necessarily match that definition, but that was on purpose just to show like straight away how it can be that can detect those errors. And on my responses, I created a 201 created. Okay, so this is the response that I create on that. Then after that, I went on design, and on my policies, sorry, for the actual order, put it on the wrong place, sorry, because I don't want that here. That's not supposed to be here. That's supposed to be against that, the order. That was when I was moving from one place to the other. Let's put that against order, because that doesn't make sense for the whole API, but it makes sense for my order since I'm validating that particular content. Okay, so I have that set up here. And what I'm going to do is, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to test it from here, straight away. You see that I have order ID 1234, client ID ABC123, blah, 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 have some comments. And if I send that, I receive a bad request. Body of the request does not conform with the definition order with its associated, which is associated content type application JSON. Integer 1234 is the maximum number of 1000, right? So that means that things that I have is not valid. It doesn't even go to the backend straight away. So cutting that story short, here is one that I have with everything that is required. And if I send that, I'm receiving a 200 OK and success, because I'm sending that to Hookbeam, right? If I remove one of those here, send it again, client email is required. If I put client email back and make order date just a normal string, my value does not validate against the format date. So you can see how powerful that is and how much of the work it can cut from you. Because I have a case where working for a government agency where we have to validate that. And in order to do that in the APM policy, I actually have to look at each one of the elements and validate manually inside the policy. So now they encapsulate all of that for me. The other thing that is quite good on that one is that make size, because you can stop straight away on the API management if you're getting the payloads that is too big for your backend, right? So you can stop it there. One thing that I notice is that the max size is expecting the content length, a header entry with the content length that every HTTP call sends. But when you're doing chunking encoding, if you're sending like multi-part messages, the content length is not part of the headers anymore. It goes as part of the actual payload. And because of that, the policy is not able to validate this, which is kind of makes sense, But one thing that one of my clients tried to do, it wanted to get the payload and say each one of the payloads that is coming, even if the total is 10 meg, if any one of those chunks are bigger than a meg, for example, I wanted to stop. And that's not possible to do with that validation. But everything here is still not valid according to my open data definition, because I only created a 201 created, right? How do I prevent that? I could come here and do one thing. I could go back to my design, and I actually have this written somewhere, so just let me copy and put that one back on the validate integrate. So what I'm going to do this time is say on my outbound, validate status code. And actually, I wanted to do that before anything happened. So validate state code and any unspecified state code action set to prevent. So now, if I run the same thing, I receive a 502 response not allowed. Okay, so instead of receiving the, it stops the message from the backend and give you that error. And if I go back to my definition and say that my response, instead of a 205, I'm expecting now a 200. That's my definition. And try to run that again. And I receive it back because now my API definition matches what is receiving. That I have the impression that you could, well, actually, you should be able to do that. You should be able to say, doing that detection, putting just on detect, and then validate the error. Then depending on the error, if it's actually saying that 201 is not a valid, you could like just change that to a 200 and pass it back, or the other way around, the 200 is not valid, you could just say that is 201 and pass it back. So, but the main thing about this is the ability to do a lot of those validations with almost no code, right? Compared to what I have to write before, is a lot less code and much more streamlined. I'm quite interested on this one is the ability to make sure that if I receive a request without the mandatory headers, it is rejected straight away. Because again, on the same government agents client that I was working on, they had a set of internal headers that any API call, any client needed to pass to allow them to track the correlation ID of the messages and who was the initial request, a whole lot of things that they use it for auditing of the use of that API. And having that on API management rejecting, which is the first stop, and rejecting that before any action is taken on the backend APIs is quite useful. So that's the third demo. And that is the end. Seems like all my USB burning that I did today actually work. I was kind of afraid. As a set of references for you, I have LogicApps SQL preview again. If you wanted to join the preview, I suggest that you do, because it's probably where LogicApps going for on-prem as an actual production storage. The Azurite reference on Microsoft Docs, if you wanted to find more information about how to set up and all that kind of stuff, that's from where I got. I just put the bit.ly there, but that's going to be sent you to the Microsoft Docs. And that IP invalidation reference page that I show you, you can find it here as well. And with that, any questions?
Thanks very much. That was good. I hadn't had a chance to look at the API management validation stuff, so that was good to have a look at. And the SQL stuff is interesting because I was talking to Beck about it, and it's going to be when you running an isolated in Azure. If you're not careful, your storage costs are going to be pretty high if you've got high throughput.
Yes, so that's what you for things like using that against the event stream or the IoT kind of stuff that messages like every second almost. The storage cost might go through the roof. Something that we didn't know about because not the type of things that we're using.
Yeah, because with the consumption model that you're doing now, you don't get charged for the storage, even though you might have a very active Logic app. And some people are thinking that the isolated Logic apps are going to be a good solution for some high throughput stuff, because you got a app service plan that's going to be associated with it. But then when you start looking at that storage cost that you'll have involved with it, it may become not as viable as it could be. But the SQL is, at least you got more of a stable and known cost because of the way it bills.
And exactly.
It will be interesting to see with the SQL, because they've got the serverless SQL that will spin down when it's not being used.
Yeah, like the elastic pools.
No, not elastic pools, but there's a serverless version of it that you can set to say, when this SQL Server is not being used, spin it down, and you don't pay for it. Well, it's because it's based on the core model, and it spins down and then spins up. I use it a lot of times for some of my development databases that I only touch every couple of months. That'll be interesting, especially even for those Logic apps that you don't run very often.
Yeah. And then you can, if that's the case, then you can standardize all your development on the same kind of kit. It doesn't matter where you are. You can like run on the cloud, bring on-prem, and it's always the same kind of configuration in a way. Just changing the connection strings, but they use it for everything. Might end up becoming the default.
So the one interesting question I posed to Beck too was around, can you run, if you're running your Logic apps on premise in a container, can you run your SQL in a container?
I think you can. I didn't.
I know you can. It's just where you persist the storage.
It would be probably similar to what I was showing with Azurite. You needed to create a volume pointing somewhere else. Otherwise, you lose that information every time.
Yep.
And you might be losing history. But
and then the other one was for development. You run them all in the same container.
Yeah, that would be crazy. But we'll try to do that. But it was good that you point to that one, because one thing that I was trying to do, and that was one of the other gotchas on Azurite, is I spent like half of my night yesterday trying to create both in LogicApps on a Docker container and put Azurite on the other Docker container and run those things together. Azurite has currently, not sure if it's a bug or something like this, but basically, when you put in that inside a Docker Compose, for example, the Azurite endpoints are not able to be hit using the host name, so the container name. And with that, my Azurite spins up, says, I'm listening on any available interface, but the LogicApps doesn't find it in any way that I could try.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any other questions. There's no questions posted into the YouTube channel. So I think that is pretty much it. Thank you very much for the presentation tonight. And the nice thing about using StreamYard is we'll have the live recording of that up as soon as we finish, because all I've got to do is add it to the playlist. So,
that's cool. Yeah. And so it was actually 55 minutes or so. I thought that was going to be no more than half an hour. So I'm happy with that, because all my demos end up working.
Okay. Thank you very much for everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next month. Thank you very much.
Thank you.